Greetings, this is Herman Trabish. Welcome to the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast for October 12th. I'm a reporter with a national online outlet called Utility Dive, and we cover at Utility Dive everything about the power sector from policy to technology. My guest today is Autumn Proudlove, who is the Associate Director for Policy and Markets with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, or as we call it, NCCETC. We're going to talk today about the biggest and newest state-led national trends in legislative and regulatory policy for grid modernization and for electric vehicles, two of NCCETC's four quarterly policy updates. But first, before we get into that, I want to acknowledge that some people might think that it's something of an ivory tower exercise to be talking about something as arcane as policy when the death counts in the Afghanistan earthquakes and the war in Israel are still rising. But the fact of the matter is, policymakers are who people go to. They are the people that policymakers went to after the horrible deaths in Paradise, California, and the Texas freeze and the Maui fires. And policymakers are who people go to avoid the threats to human well-being when electricity rates start rising. Isn't that true, Autumn?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I fully agree. It can sometimes be a little difficult to think about all the intricacies of clean energy policy while there are things like this going on, but policy certainly has an impact on outcomes for people and can really do a lot to make the world a better place. So, definitely not something to be ignored.
Right. And it's the place where people go when to work out solutions. And that's what this podcast is really intended to be. It's about power sector solutions. And it's about asking the questions that of what will work and what won't work. So, Autumn, I want to talk a little bit about NCCETC's 50 states reports. Um, we've been talking since you had one report on solar, but that,
Mhm.
that solar policy updates listed comprehensively investigated the activities that were of concern when people first started trying to integrate distributed energy resources into the power system. And the next update that you guys did was for grid modernization, which we're going to talk about today, which was sort of the solution for that problem of integrating distributed energy resources. And then electric vehicles came along and they made the situation with the distribution system more complicated. And so now you guys have started a fourth NCCETC update on uh, integrated solutions for decarbonization that address those kinds of problems, right? That's kind of the where you're going with this is taking on the policy answers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and a lot of people, they know us for the Desire database, the database of state incentives for renewables efficiency, but has everything that's currently in place there for policies and incentives with clean energy. Our 50 states reports are tracking, what's under consideration and the policy changes that we're seeing all across the country. So, solar, distributed energy resources, grid modernization, electric vehicles, decarbonization, those are all things that are causing a lot of policy and regulatory change necessarily. So that's where we're tracking these things where, everything is happening so rapidly. It's tough to keep on top of and to see what are all the different options that are out there. So that's what we're looking for and making available to people.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Desire because that's one of the most comprehensive databases on all the state policy. You can go there and you can find any state policy, and you can find it by state, you can find it by technology. There's all kinds of ways to search, so it's a really valuable resource that people tend to overlook. But we are here to talk about grid modernization policy and electric vehicle policy. I was kind of amazed to see the news report from the most recent policy update on grid modernization. Every single state now is
Mhm.
working on grid modernization. So I want to ask you, what the overall trends are, and I want to go to get some of the details of what's happening in which states. But before we get into that, just briefly, uh, can you tell me a little, can you sort of tell our listeners what is grid modernization? Is it something from the Jetsons, or is it something that we can do now?
Yeah, and it's funny you asked that because grid modernization is something I think everybody has a different definition of. Um, for our purposes, we take a very kind of broad look at grid modernization. It's, modernizing the electric distribution system, and that can be done through smart grid technologies. It can be done through distributed energy resources, storage, but it's also a lot of grid planning and rate design that gives the customers the price signal to adopt distributed energy resources. Utility business models, which also direct why and where utilities invest in grid infrastructure. So we kind of look at all of that, all the investments that are being made, and all of the planning and the price signals and incentives that go into that.
So there's a lot of stuff there. I mean, we might, in another life, when we had an infinite amount of time, stop and define every one of those types of grid modernization, but we're not going to do that right now. Instead, what I want to do is talk about the overall trends, because what the 50 states reports do is it comprehensively lists every policy activity each quarter for every state. And it lists them by state, and it also lists them by technology areas. But out of that remarkable melange of information, you guys are able to see national trends that are emerging from state-led initiatives. And we're talking about initiatives at the legislative level and at the regulatory level, at the commissions. So, and I want to, before we get to you, and I apologize for taking time, Autumn, but it is important to note that that's how we do regulation in this country, is at the of electricity, is at the state level. We have a federal situation, a federal regulatory commission, but the bulk of the initiatives come from the states. So when I ask you, what are the overall trends that you're seeing emerging from all this activity in every state on grid modernization? What are you seeing? Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing, maybe the numbers of different kinds of policy efforts, and then let's get in after that into the specific state initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that so much of energy policy, and specifically clean energy policy, is done at the state level, which kind of leads into, one of the biggest things that we see is that states are at very different stages of grid modernization, and they're taking very different approaches to it. I think overall, something that I've noticed over the years of tracking this is that we're starting to see some more coordination now. So there are a lot of states that are establishing distribution system planning rules. So grid investments are being planned and proposed as a part of this process. So it's a lot more formal and it's a lot more transparent, rather than maybe some more ad hoc utility proposals that you'd see. So definitely, getting ahead of it and planning and doing this in a more coordinated fashion with specific objectives and priorities for grid modernization. And then another, big picture overarching thing we've seen has been so much innovation. There are new approaches and pilots being undertaken all the time across the country, and states are very much interested in learning from each other and trying new approaches. So that's also something we're trying to facilitate, is making all of these different pilots and approaches known so that people can take notice and maybe see if that works for their state. So, you see a lot of innovation in rate design, different time of use structures and critical peak pricing. There's a lot of, resiliency as a service programs, virtual power plants. The Maine's looking at creating a distribution system operator. So many different things that are happening all across the country right now. And it's very exciting to see the creativity that's going into that.
Are there any states that you would consider leaders in this area?
Mm. I mean, it all depends on what you would consider a leader and what the state's goals are ultimately that they're trying to achieve. I think a lot of people see California and New York as maybe further ahead with grid modernization based on a lot of the efforts that they've already taken and where they're at with deploying this infrastructure. A lot of the New England states are also getting pretty creative and are rather far along in their processes. Massachusetts and Maine, with some of the steps that they're taking, are pretty exciting. Individual utilities, Green Mountain Power is doing a lot in Vermont with storage, and they have a new resilient communities pilot with solar and storage and EV charging at individual homes. So, it kind of depends. Each state is doing their own thing, but, maybe the ones you typically would kind of think of, the Californias and New Yorks, from a more traditional perspective.
Is there any particular state that surprises you with what they're doing?
Mm.
Atypical for like Illinois, I know has been doing some interesting things. They're talking about um, some aspects of new form of regulation. It, that's got to be surprising.
Yeah, Illinois is doing some interesting things with beneficial electrification plans and distribution system planning. Hawaii's got a lot of interesting stuff with advanced rate design going on, especially with how much they have in terms of distributed energy resources. You even have, utilities like Duke here in North Carolina that are doing a lot of innovative rate pilots and EV charging pilots that you might not expect to see in more of a traditional regulated utility territory. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on. There's a Tampa Electric pilot in Florida, kind of microgrids at homes. But yeah, there, too many to list.
Okay, I know, and I want to get to electric vehicle policy before we run out of time, but there was of the overall trends in grid modernization. Is there anything you want to point to? I mean, not overall trends, but emerging trends, new things that are happening. Is there anything you want to point to on grid modernization before we move to electric vehicles?
Yeah, so I guess, last quarter, our Q2 2023 reports, some of the trends that we were talking about there were, states and utilities really starting to move forward on performance-based regulation. So really trying to align the utilities' interest with the public's interest, which will in turn determine a lot of the grid investments that are made. So we're seeing more concrete steps being taken on that in, a sizable number of states. Also more interest in long duration storage, where most of the storage we've seen till now has been shorter duration. We're starting to see states actually undertaking studies on long duration storage, including plans to add long duration storage in their integrated resource plans. So some material steps on that. And then also, on integrated resource plans, the amount of storage that we're seeing utilities planning to add within the next 10 to 15 years is huge. It's a lot, and it's often paired with very large additions of renewables as well. So, we see that kind of also in terms of grid modernization, trying to integrate all of those renewables to the grid. And one of the major approaches is by adding storage.
Yeah, it's amazing what's happening in storage. Okay, and speaking of storage, that brings us to electric vehicles because one of the big things with electric vehicles is using your car as your home backup. We're ways away from that. We're going to have two guests on the podcast next week talking about how you do that and how you manage it. One from right there in your home state of North Carolina from Duke Energy. But let's move to electric vehicles. Overall trends. Let's first of all talk about the overall trends in electric vehicle policy. What are people trying to do?
Yeah, I think overall, a lot of what we're seeing is trying to just push the market, move it forward. So there's a lot of states adopting targets for their fleets to be electric or zero emission, and also now moving beyond just government fleets to the general market, creating targets for EV and ZEV adoption for the entire market. a lot of incentive programs being adopted now for electric vehicles and for charging stations. So all of that's really intended to try to push adoption of these technologies. And then, the other big element I think we're seeing is considering how to manage electric vehicle charging and its impacts on the grids. So there's a lot of action being undertaken with electric vehicle rate design, so moving toward more time of use approaches, as well as more active managed charging. Also a lot of vehicle to grid pilots starting to pop up. So, the big areas and the big trends I'd say is, just pushing the market ahead and then managing the impacts on the grid.
Right. And that's happening everywhere. Everyone thinks, oh, it's all just California or it's just California, Massachusetts. But right there in North Carolina, Duke Energy has got some amazing pilots, which we're going to talk about on the podcast next week. Are there any states that you would point to as other than those that I mentioned as leaders?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of states that are, again, kind of taking that coordinated approach, like with grid modernization, of doing these transportation electrification plans. So there's Minnesota, New Mexico, a number of states are starting to do that. Arizona, where they're laying out kind of their plans for the future and all of the different rates and the pilots and the programs that they're starting to offer. So I think that's a pretty interesting approach that's being taken. And then you have some states that have really aggressive just targets for zero emission vehicle adoption. A lot of the Northeast states, California keeps adopting new standards, which then keep being adopted by other states following suit. So maybe those would be some of the leaders.
In the emerging trends, we're running short of time, so I want to get to this one thing. Charging as a service was one of the emerging trends you mentioned in the most recent policy update. I think that's so interesting. Do you think that's something that's going to catch on where people pay a monthly fee, I think? Can you explain that? And do you think it's going to catch on?
It seems to be catching on from what we've seen. There were a few proposals, and now there are quite a few that we're seeing all across the country from different utilities. In general, we've seen a lot of movement away from utilities actually owning charging stations and more toward it's called the make-ready model, where they own the make-ready infrastructure and private companies can actually own the charging stations. But the exception, I'd say, is with these charging as a service programs where the utilities actually own and maintain the charging stations on customer properties. I think it's an interesting option for customers to have. It can be simple, they're just working through their utility. If they can't afford a charging station or they don't have financing available to them, it could really help increase access to charging for some of those demographics and groups that might not have had access before.
Okay. And we're going to have one of the national leaders, Phil Jones, former Washington State Commissioner, on the podcast next week, at the end of the week, talking about this discussion about utilities owning chargers versus other people owning chargers. I think that's about all we have time for, Autumn. Is there anything concluding you want to say? I have a concluding question, which might be a leading question, but who do you think is driving policy in this country? Do you think it's the top down, or do you think it's customers driving policy?
I think it's often a mix of things, and the two aren't unrelated. Where customers often drive, what policymakers are looking to do. I think a lot of it is just so much. The options have increased, the technologies that we have available have increased, and that necessitates changing of the policy environment where it's no longer just a one-way street for electricity, but more of a web, and customers can participate, and policymakers do recognize this. So kind of requires a rethinking of our policy and regulatory structures.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what we're doing, a lot of rethinking, and that's what the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast is here to do, is to facilitate and inform that rethinking. So, Autumn Proudlove of North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this stuff today. I think that's going to do it for us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.